Okay, here's Persepolis again. By the time Alexander reached this place, he was leading an army of millionaires. Modern estimates of the amount of loot that was taken from Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis vary a lot. J.B. Burry says 120,000 talents of gold were taken from Persepolis alone, but Arrian gives no number. Durant says 50,000 were taken from Susa, which is about what Plutarch says. A talent was 57 pounds, so one talent would be worth something like $250,000 today, and the purchasing power of that much gold in antiquity would have been far greater than it is today. If a man had anything like a talent in gold, he didn't need to work for the rest of his life, and a lot of the men in Alexander's army were beginning to think seriously about going home to spend their money. And apart from the money issue, it was now 3 years since many of the men had seen their homes and families. Alexander couldn't have cared less about money or home. He was motivated by a greed for adventure and conquest, and gave no thought to turning back. Consequently, a certain tension became noticeable in the army, which Alexander tried to overcome by stressing that they still had to catch Darius. Once Darius is out of the way, the implication was, we can all go back to Greece. Before Alexander left to go north and try to find Darius, the palace here was burned down and never rebuilt. According to Plutarch, the idea of destroying it was given to Alexander by a Greek prostitute named Thais, who suggested it as revenge for what the Persians had done to Athens. While Alexander was at Persepolis, Darius was at Ecbatana, of which there is little left here, about 100 miles southwest of modern Tehran. Alexander hoped he would wait for him, offer battle, and give him another good chance to catch him, but he fled east. By this time, he had, of course, entirely lost the confidence of his army, and Bessus, one of his generals, presided over the assassination of Darius on the shore of the Caspian Sea. Arrian, in summarizing the life of Darius, describes it simply as having been an unbroken succession of disasters. Now the motivation to go east became the need to catch the assassins, who might, well, Alexander could argue, be a bigger threat than Darius the Loser, as he might be called today.
It's hard to follow Alexander's movements very closely over the next 3 years or so. He did eventually capture Bessus and execute him in what's now Uzbekistan, north of the Oxus River. But the capture of Bessus was really only a minor goal compared to what was coming more and more to look like an attempt to conquer or at least beat up the whole world. Iconium was one of the cities he is said to have founded, or at least renamed in honor of himself. Extensive ruins survived here until the unrestricted looting of the past couple of decades destroyed and or dug up what was left. He was attempting to maintain some sort of control over the people who had nominally surrendered to him along the way, but communication was, of course, difficult, and he never really established anything like a coherent empire. The territory he really controlled was not consistently much larger than the perimeter of his encampment when he went to bed at night. One of the most memorable parts of Arrian's history tells the story of the taking of the Sogdian Rock, thought to be an impregnable fortress. This is one of a dozen places alleged to be the thing itself, but nothing surviving anywhere really matches up with Arrian's account very closely.
He wandered around in the Hindu Kush region here in northern Afghanistan, and in 327 came through the Khyber Pass into the Swat Valley of Pakistan. Alexander married Roxanne, the
daughter of the king of conquered Sogdiana,
which created some comment among the Greeks who viewed this union between Greek and barbarian as unworthy. But Alexander himself was becoming increasingly Oriental in his outlook. He began to make less distinction between Greeks and Persians and to assign important duties to the latter as well as to his Macedonians. The way in which he arranged the murders of men he perceived to be enemies, massacred whole towns, including women and children, tortured Bessus to death, and so on, is sometimes said to show that he was becoming more of a barbarian in more senses than one. This is the Swat Valley now in northern Pakistan. He could have had only the vaguest idea of the geography of India, let alone of what lay beyond, but he apparently decided to bound his so-called empire on the east with the Indus River, but that didn't mean he intended to stop there. Conquests beyond it would just be regarded differently as satellite or client states with a different political status than what was west of the Indus. At the Hydaspes, the modern Jhelum River east of the Indus, he met his first serious opposition in some time under the Indian princeling Porus, who ruled the area between the Indus and the Chenab River. He had an army of about 40,000 men on the east bank of the Jhelum, but Alexander was able to outflank and defeat him. Impressed with his bravery and character, however, Alexander appointed him to return to his position as governor. At the Hyphasis River, the modern Sutlej on the border between modern Pakistan and modern India, Alexander's army, virtually as one, finally refused to go any farther. He tried to persuade them just to keep going until they reached the ocean, but they refused to even cross the river, which was wise. If they'd kept going, they probably would have just disappeared somewhere in India or China. At length he gave in, having been finally conquered, not by an enemy, as he put it, but by his own army. And this army moved south then, down the Indus Valley to where modern Karachi is. Instead of returning the way he had come, he decided to go through the southern desert of Gedroja, now called the Makran, one of the most forbidding places in the world. Plutarch says he set out with 135,000 soldiers, camp followers, and various other sorts of hangers-on who must truly have thought he really was a god to accompany him through this absolute wasteland that lay ahead, and of the desolation of which they must have had at least some idea. Plutarch says he lost 75,000 of them. J.B. Bury says he left with 30,000 and lost 15,000. Durant says he lost 10,000. Unless Bury and Durant were there, I don't know what they're basing their guesses on. Plutarch's numbers seem way too high, but if you don't like them, you just have to make up some of your own. During the worst part of the desert crossing, it is said that someone found a small trickle of water that just filled a helmet, which was taken to Alexander, who disdainfully poured it on the ground, which Arrian says was as good as a drink for every man in the army. He left the Indus in August of 325 and arrived back at Susa, having crossed the 1,500 miles between them in December. This is a coin with his image on it, and coin portraits are generally thought to be among the most accurate, so this might be about as good a likeness as we'll ever see of him. He certainly did not pose for most of the surviving busts that pretend to portray him. He was not a well man when he arrived back at Susa, although he was still, after all he'd been through and all he'd done, only 31 years old. He had been wounded several times, most seriously in an attack on a town in the Indus Valley when he had jumped down from the wall inside the city to inspire his men and been shot in the chest with an arrow. He also suffered from alcoholism, which became a more pronounced problem after the death of his close friend Hephaestion the next year. On one occasion, shortly before his death, he is said to have consumed 6 quarts of wine in an evening. Some think he may also have had malaria. Some think he was poisoned, perhaps even with the connivance of Aristotle, whose nephew he had executed. But whatever brought death, it took him at Babylon in June of 323. It is said that when his generals asked him on his deathbed to whom he would leave the empire, he answered, to the strongest. But no one was the strongest, and since Alexander, the greatest leader of the day, had not been able to hold his conquests together, it was going to be impossible for anyone else to do it. Surprisingly, it is not absolutely certain where he was buried, but the favorite choice among scholars now is probably Alexandria. The Hellenistic period in Greek art lasts from Alexander's day to the rise of Rome in the 2nd century BC, so it's roughly the period from, say, 350 to 150 BC. It is said that one of the things that characterizes the art of Hellenistic of the Hellenistic period is a certain romantic emotionalism of the sort that we see in the bust of Alexander on the left, while the Roman bust of him on the right depicts him less as a charismatic hero and more as a kind of distinguished statesman. It's dangerous to generalize from just one or two examples, however. Although, as I said, we don't know where or in what he was buried, the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul has what is known as the Alexander sarcophagus, which is called that not because it was his, but because his adventures are thought to be the subject of its decoration. It was apparently actually made for a fellow from Sidon in Phoenicia, modern Lebanon. I used the term romantic in describing the Hellenistic bust of Alexander we just saw, but the later style to which the Hellenistic look is compared most often is the Baroque. It typically has the same emotional intensity about it. It's action-packed, the bodies are heroic in size, and virtuoso treatment of difficult subjects was much admired. All those things could be said about the Alexander sarcophagus and its decoration here. This gives you a better look at part of it. H.D.F. Kitto says that the political history of the late 4th century in Greece is confused, wearisome, and depressing, so we won't spend much time on it. The fellow who was named Alexander's successor was his half-brother Philip Aridaeus, Philip II's son by an exotic dancer. Since he was an imbecile, however, Alexander's general Perdiccas was named regent. Alexander's other chief commanders divided the actual control of what Alexander had conquered among themselves, and Antipater, who had been regent of Macedonia in Alexander's absence, was given that. After his son Cassander took over Macedonia, he had Olympias, Roxanne, and the latter's son by Alexander, known as Alexander Igus, all killed. Lysimachus, another of his generals, got Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. Antigonus got Phrygia and Lydia in Asia Minor. But the big winners were Seleucus, who eventually got most of what was east of the Mediterranean, and Ptolemy, who got Egypt. The Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties would then dominate the eastern Mediterranean until the coming of the Romans. But all of the Diadochi, as the successors of Alexander and their descendants are called as a class, fought constantly. Nationalism of the sort that motivated the Athenians and Spartans in the 5th century became less of a justification for war and was replaced by just simple greed. This is a bust of Ptolemy, who as Pharaoh Ptolemy I began the rule of his family in Egypt, a rule they would maintain for 14 generations. His lost memoirs were, as I mentioned, one of Arrian's main sources for his account of the adventures of Alexander. It's hard to be very specific about the effects of Alexander's life and adventures, but in addition to opening, as I suggested, an era of political opportunism, it's usually said that what he did was instrumental to the spread of Greek culture that characterized the whole Hellenistic period following him. All over the Mediterranean and far to the east of it, Greek became the language of scholarship and business, and Greek models and literature and the visual arts came to be imitated from Gibraltar to the Indus River. As late as the 2nd century A.D., a Roman who couldn't speak Greek couldn't claim to be a scholar, and it's only a slight exaggeration to say that because of Alexander, the New Testament was written in a language Jesus himself couldn't speak. Many new cultural centers developed, places like Alexandria itself, of course, and Carthage, Pergamum, and by the 2nd century Rome, which were the Lodis and Manticas of civilization before Alexander's day, became more important than Athens itself. Among all the Hellenistic works I'm going to show, not a one was made in Athens. This is a painting which purports to give you some idea of what ancient Alexandria was like. It's primarily known today for its great library, with which such intellectual giants as Euclid and Aristarchus, the first man to maintain that the earth is round and rotates and also revolves around the sun, and Eratosthenes, who was the first guy to closely estimate the size of the earth, were all connected. When Ptolemy, who was very interested in what Euclid was doing, asked if there weren't some easy way to understand his work, Euclid is supposed to have responded, "No, sire, there is no royal road to geometry."
Ptolemy also gets credit for initiating the project to build the famous lighthouse at Alexandria, which would be completed by his son. Unfortunately, today nothing remains of either the library or the lighthouse.
This is a model of ancient Pergamum, modern Bergama, near the west coast of Asia Minor. After Alexander's death, it was acquired by his general Lysimachus, who left it in charge of a fellow named Philetaerus. When Lysimachus fought Seleucus at the Battle of Corpadion in 281, however, Philetaerus supported Seleucus, so when Lysimachus was defeated and killed, he was allowed to keep Pergamum, which went on under the control of his family to become one of the showplaces of the Hellenistic world. Under the administration of Eumenes II, who began his reign in 197 BC, the library here was second only to that in Alexandria, and the altar of Zeus, which he commissioned, is the Hellenistic equivalent to the Parthenon in its sculptural decoration. In 133, the last member of the dynasty willed his territory to Rome, and in Augustus's day it replaced Ephesus as the capital of the Roman province of Asia. In this picture you can see where the library was. Eumenes II is said to have collected 200,000 scrolls here. Most modern authorities don't think the site would have held a library of that size, however. The library at Alexandria is said to have had 500,000 scrolls at its height. When the Ptolemies became jealous of the library here, though, a law was passed in Alexandria forbidding the export of papyrus. As a result, the librarians at Pergamum turned to sheepskin or parchment, a word apparently derived from the name of the city. Pergamum isn't as famous for scholars as Alexandria, but Galen, the famous physician, was born here. This is the amazing theater at Pergamum. The kaveias, or seating arrangements, of most Greek theaters are far wider than they are high, but the site here wasn't amenable to that, so it became the steepest and highest of all such theaters, 80 rows from top to bottom, compared to 55 rows at Epidaurus. Most Greek theaters are actually Hellenistic in that they were heavily remodeled in this era. We do have some large fragments of plays, comedies actually, by Menander, who was a contemporary of Alexander the Great, surviving, but after the death of Aristophanes we get no more complete plays until the work of Plautus, the earliest surviving Latin playwright in the 3rd century BC. In the distance you can see where the altar of Zeus once was. And here is a closer view of that site with the surviving fragments of the foundation. In 1871, Karl Humann, who was a German engineer and amateur archaeologist working for the Turkish government, found a slab from this in a Byzantine wall and went on to uncover 97 more, plus about 2,000 other fragments, which he bought, and it was with this effort that the whole excavation of Pergamum began. His discoveries were shipped to Berlin, where a large part of the altar has now been reconstructed in the Pergamum or Pergamon Museum. And this is the way that reconstruction looks now. The frieze in its original form was about 400 feet long, so it's not as long as the Parthenon frieze, but it's much higher. The figures are life-size. The overall theme is the battle between the gods and the giants, which, as we've heard, is one of those episodes used by the Greeks to represent the battle between civilization and barbarism, between the human and the inhuman. It's likely that the work was also meant to commemorate the victory which Eumenes had won over an army of Gauls in 184 BC. The latter were eventually driven out of Asia Minor and moved west to settle in France and Spain, where many other Gauls were already in residence. You can see part of the frieze up close.
At the left is Hecate battling one giant, while another handsomer one faces Artemis at the right, who is aided by one of the Molossian hounds, who look like lions here. They were regarded as the pit bulls of the ancient world and are still around as the American Molossus, though apparently the latter is not quite the same animal.
The decoration of the altar of Zeus as a whole is often considered to be the masterpiece of the Hellenistic style, and it certainly illustrates the things people usually associate with that style. Things, as I said, like the heroically muscled figures, emotion, energy, drama, and the fact that it's a complex and difficult composition treated in a virtuoso way. It's hard to identify all the actors and be sure what's going on. In this scene, it's thought that Athena in the center has the giant Alcyoneus at the left by the hair. Alcyoneus looks an awful lot like Laocoon in the Vatican, so hold this in your mind's eye a little while till we see that.
Only one possible signature survives here, presumably that of an otherwise unknown artist, among the whole staff that would have been involved with this colossal project.
Eumenes also paid for the building of a Stoa in Athens, which used to be below the southwest corner of the Acropolis, and his successor Attalus II had one built in the Agora there in gratitude for the education he got in the schools of the city. In the 1950s, it was reconstructed to serve as the Agora Museum with money from American donors. Originally, the Stoas served primarily as something like shopping malls. Here's the lower floor inside the open colonnade. On the right, you can see what would have been entrances to shops. I mentioned that Socrates liked to meet his philosophy-loving friends in the Stoas, and the Stoic philosophy, in fact, got its name from the fact that the 3rd century philosopher Zeno the Stoic, as he was called, liked to hang out in them as well. As we'll see next quarter, the Stoic point of view was to make a big impact on Rome and become sort of an official state philosophy, and it can be argued that the success of Stoicism, like the popularity of Plato's proto-Christian worldview, made the ultimate victory of Christianity easier. We've seen a lot of portraits of famous people in Greek history, but I mentioned some time ago that at least most of them are thought by modern scholars to be Roman copies. H.W. Jansen thinks that this, in fact, is the earliest surviving Greek portrait, and the subject is perhaps Mausolus, the satrap of Caria in southwestern Asia Minor, who made his home in Halicarnassus and died in 353. It's now in the British Museum. It may not be Mausolus, but Jansen thinks it's a portrait of someone in any case. About 10 feet tall, it was among the dozens of statues adorning the 160-foot-high tomb of Mausolus himself, the original mausoleum, which was considered one of the 7 wonders of the world. And projects on such a colossal scale are also characteristic of the Hellenistic period. Things like the Colossus of Rhodes and the lighthouse at Alexandria were also the biggest things of their kind yet constructed. It's thought that Scopas, one of the great figures in the history of Greek sculpture, was involved with the mausoleum project, so it's possible that this is his work, but there are very few, if any, works of Greek sculpture we can confidently connect to the great names in the art of the era. This is the so-called Hermes of Praxiteles in the museum at Olympia where it was found, and it used to be thought that this was certainly the work of Praxiteles because it not only has the look of a masterpiece, the Greek writer Pausanias mentions seeing what seems to be this very work at Olympia in the 2nd century A.D. But you have to keep in mind that even though Pausanias is an ancient authority all right, he was writing something like 500 years after Praxiteles made anything, and many modern scholars believe that, fine as this is, it is a copy of the original. In any case, as I suggested, it certainly displays the overall character of the original, especially the emphasis on beauty for its own sake and surface finish. The sensuous effect of the exaggerated contrapposto is part of this too. The right arm was once holding something up, perhaps a bunch of grapes to interest the infant Dionysus on his left arm. Zeus had Hermes take his infant son Dionysus to be raised by the nymphs of Mount Nysa so that no harm would befall him from Hera, Zeus's jealous and often betrayed wife, and that's the episode that's portrayed here. The original Venus of Cnidus was also done by Praxiteles, But the original of that is not thought to survive either, although I think it might be hard to distinguish it from among the 49 versions of it which Kenneth Clark says are in the museums of the world. The model for the original is said to have been the sculptor's mistress Phryne, and the work was commissioned by the island of Kos, but the nudity of it is said to have so shocked the people there that they wouldn't pay for it, and Praxiteles sold it to the city of Cnidus instead. It is in fact regarded as the earliest standing female nude by a major Greek sculptor. It's important to notice that statues like this one and the Hermes we just saw, even though they nominally represent gods, were not meant to be worshipped as we usually use that term. They were meant to be something much more like works of art in the manner of Michelangelo's David than cult statues or idols which were worshipped in any real sense. In the Vatican here, you can see the Apoxyomenos, or athlete scraping oil off his body, which is, like the so-called Hermes of Praxiteles, probably actually a fine copy of the original, in this case by Lysippus, who is said to have made 1,500 statues in bronze. Lysippus was considered the greatest sculptor of Alexander the Great's day, and like Apelles, considered the greatest painter of the day. He was from the little Peloponnesian town of Sicyon, which means cucumber. This would be like having both Michelangelo and Raphael born in Fresno. And it underscores again the random nature of genius. The Nike or Victory of Samothrace is a familiar Hellenistic work because it is displayed at the top of the main staircase in the Louvre, where the theatrical quality of it is clearly accentuated. The goddess is represented on the prow of a ship, and the whole ensemble was probably meant to commemorate some naval victory in the North Aegean, circa 200 BC. Again, though nominally representing a goddess, what it really represents is victory. Using Nike this way tells everyone immediately what the purpose of this monument is. It's kind of like a very elaborate hieroglyphic. In 1506, the Laocoon, now in the Vatican, was dug out of the rubble of the Baths of Titus in Rome, and it is thought to be the original mentioned by Pliny the Elder, who saw it in the Palace of Titus 2,000 years ago, and called it the greatest achievement in the whole history of sculpture. He attributed it to Agesandro of Rhodes in his school, and most modern scholars accept this, although Pliny does say it was cut from a single block, and this wasn't. The thought is that Pliny just didn't look at it closely enough. I mentioned earlier that it looks a lot like the figure of the giant Alcyoneus at Pergamum. It represents the Trojan who opposed letting the horse in the city, saying, according to Virgil, Timeo Danaos et Dona Ferentes, I fear Greeks even bearing gifts. But before Laocoon could win his case, serpents came to get rid of him as well as his sons, and that's the episode depicted. Since the Romans considered themselves in effect descended from the Trojans via Aeneas, they may have regarded Laocoon himself as a hero, someone to whom their ancestors should have paid attention. The work was much commented upon in the 18th century by the German Grecophiles Winckelmann and Lessing, both of whom regarded it highly while interpreting it in different ways, but it's hard for most of us today to get very excited about their theories of aesthetics.
As a technical accomplishment, it's pretty much in the category of the unsurpassable, but
to me, Laocoon has always looked too big for the serpents to kill. And why is he sitting down? For well over a century after she was found in 1820 on the island of Melos, or Milo, the so-called Venus de Milo, also often attributed to Agesander, was considered to be the sculptural equivalent to female perfection. Now, however, she's visited more in the way one would visit an aging movie star for an autograph rather than in the way one would visit a real example of feminine beauty possessed of what Michael Wood called a delicate carnality. Jansen doesn't even mention her at all. The pose is strange, and all sorts of theories have been suggested for what she might be doing with her hands, none convincing, and none including holding her clothes on. Just as the Venus de Milo was long thought to embody ideal femininity, the Apollo Belvedere in the Vatican was thought to embody ideal masculinity. Somewhat surprisingly, neither the Venus nor Apollo here are ever referred to in surviving ancient sources. The Apollo is first mentioned as in the garden of Pope Julius II's family church, San Pietro in Vincoli in Rome, in the late 15th century. Where and by whom it was made are both uncertain, but H.W. Jansen calls it a marble copy of a bronze Greek original of either the 4th or 1st century BC. The official word from the Vatican is that it's a marble copy made about 130 BC of an original made about 330 BC. In any case, 250 years ago, Johann Joachim Winckelmann described it as the greatest thing to survive from all of classical antiquity. But tastes change, and now you're not supposed to like it. The fellow looks to most modern critics like a kind of pompous brat, the classical equivalent to a male model who's just had his hair done at Mr. Luigi's and is showing off the latest Giovanni Versace cape. He's too pretty, and modern taste runs more toward the style of the Apollo at Olympia, who doesn't look like such a self-absorbed poseur. Well, by the time the Apollo Belvedere was made, and probably by the time several other works we've seen were made, Rome was well on its way to becoming the next big thing in the history of Euro-Mediterranean civilization, as well as the civilization with which most European countries would really begin their own histories. But before the Romans had done anything worth mentioning in Italy, there were the Etruscans. According to Herodotus, they came under the leadership of Tyrannus from Lydia in Asia Minor. Some think they came across the Alps, though, and some think they were essentially indigenous. In any case, by about 700 BC, they were beginning to produce things we associate with civilization. These are the so-called Pyrgi or Pyrgi tablets now in the Villa Giulia in Rome, which is one of the major repositories of Etruscan art and souvenirs. They are gold and were written about 600 BC, and in their respective languages
Apparently.
record the same message. The one on the left is in a Phoenician dialect, and the one on the right is in Etruscan. So we know what the Etruscan one says because we know what the Phoenician one says. It's something about a dedication of something to a goddess. But unfortunately, you see here one of the few surviving documents and one of the longest in Etruscan. And barring the discovery of more to work with, it's unlikely this language will ever really be decipherable. If all Champollion had had to work with was the Rosetta Stone, he would have gotten nowhere for all his genius. What can be told is that it is not an Indo-European language, and it isn't closely related to any other language either. The Etruscans used the Greek alphabet, so that's some help. Often, as I've suggested, to be able to pronounce a word is to learn its meaning, but this is something of only limited value. Here's an Etruscan mirror back which illustrates two of the things the Etruscans were famous for, bronze work and fortune telling. In fact, there's an Etruscan word inscribed on it, or at least a word written by an Etruscan. It's written in
Archaic
Greek characters. The word is Calchas, the name of the chief seer of the Greeks in the Iliad. He's looking at a sheep's liver and is acting, therefore, as what the Romans called a haruspex, or liver reader, who could foretell the future by such examination. Long after the Romans had taken over Etruria, they still respected the supposed magical and divining skills of the Etruscans, and often consulted haruspexes or other sorts of sorcerers before important events. Those who claimed to tell the future from bird behavior were called auspexes. Those who could hear the voice of the gods in thunder were called fulgiatores, and so on. This is a sort of liver map made of bronze of the kind used by haruspexes in their work. Apropos of the Auspexes, the bird-seer, the story goes that at the Battle of Lake Regillus, the Roman commander had the enemy right where he wanted him and was ready to attack. The flagship's resident Auspex was called to bring some chickens out to see if they would eat grain, which would be a propitious sign. They wouldn't take even a nibble, as meanwhile the enemy were sailing out of their vulnerable position. Suddenly the Roman commander picked up the chickens and threw them overboard, saying, "True, they might not want to eat, but they're drinking a lot." He ordered the fleet into battle and won a great victory. Most of what we know about the Etruscans and most of the Etruscan art that survives has come from tombs like these at Cerveteri north of Rome. This kind of tumulus tomb suddenly became popular in Etruria around 700 BC, which seems to suggest the arrival of a new people, but there's really nothing much like these anywhere else, so that theory hasn't convinced everyone. Before they began using these large tumuli, most Etruscan dead were cremated and buried in urns, much less elaborate tombs. They might vaguely remind you of the so-called treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, but that was built 500 years before this, and there doesn't seem to be more than a sort of superficial similarity between them anyway. Some have even suggested a resemblance to the pyramids, but that's really stretching what can be called resemblance. Many such tombs have been found unrobbed because the Romans, as I mentioned, associated magic and mystery with the Etruscans and apparently avoided their cemeteries out of superstitious fear. By the time this fear had subsided, many Etruscan cemeteries had become so overgrown that they were essentially indistinguishable from the natural landscape and survived till modern times. Some until aerial photos taken during World War II disclosed strange white circles where the grass that grew on top of the tombs died in the summer before the grass growing around them the roots of which could still reach water. One of the most impressive of all Etruscan discoveries was made at Cerveteri in 1836, when a general named Regalini and a priest who was a friend of his named Galassi found the tomb named for them with 3 bodies and some 650 artifacts still inside, many of gold. This is a gold breastplate or pectoral decorated with bands of small animal figures now in the Vatican with the rest of the collection. These are also among the earliest examples of Etruscan art ever found. The date assigned to the tomb is about 700 BC. This is a golden bowl with a sort of procession of armed men around the inner rim, and within that scenes of hunting involving lions. These bracelets are also from the same tomb. Clearly the people who owned this tomb thought they could take their treasure with them, or else they just didn't want anyone else to have it. The usual view is that of all ancient people outside the Egyptians, the Etruscans were the ones perhaps most devoted to the conception of a life after death, before the Christians anyway. But so little survives of what they wrote, it's hard to be very certain what they thought about anything. This is another tomb at Cerveteri, which is decorated with reliefs of everyday objects, from pots and pans to swords and shields. It is, in fact, called because of this the Tomb of the Reliefs, and it seems to have been laid out to resemble a regular above-ground house, except that it had 40 bodies buried in it. You should notice the image of Kerberos, the 3-headed dog, which was the guardian of Hades, according to the Greek view of the matter. As I mentioned, the Etruscan language was written in Greek characters. A lot of fine Greek things have been found in tombs like this, and the presence of Kerberos also suggests the traditional pessimistic Greek view of death as unpleasant even for heroes. This is another view of part of the decoration, which even includes a cat and a duck. No actual above-ground Etruscan buildings do survive, apart from a few foundations. They apparently built mostly in wood. Another major Etruscan site is at Tarquinia, again near the coast north of Rome, and the tombs here are even less obvious to the casual observer today than the ones at Cerveteri. The structure at the entrance to this one is modern. It is these essentially underground tombs that have the finest Etruscan paintings in them. Apart from cave paintings, these are essentially the oldest paintings on the European mainland, most having been done between about 550 and 450 BC. This picture is in the so-called Tomb of Hunting and Fishing, which is one of the earliest. It's reminiscent of what we saw in the Egyptian tombs of the 18th dynasty nearly 1,000 years before, and almost certainly inaccessible to Etruscan art students, so the resemblance, a devotion to what Paul McKendrick calls the brainless life, is thought coincidental. The Romans, as I said, regarded the Etruscans as a weird and spooky people, and that's the view D.H. Lawrence took in his treatment of them in Etruscan Places. But the tomb paintings aren't consistent with that view at all. Here's a fellow playing an aulos. These images remind me of the song that goes, "Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. We'd sing and dance forever and a day. We'd live the life we choose, we'd fight and never lose. Those were the days, oh yes, those were the days." We're going to hear now an attempt by some of the members of Walter Maioli's group Sinalia to reconstruct the sound of some ancient Roman instruments, if not Etruscan ones. We've heard some of those efforts in passing as this lecture's gone on already. Such efforts, as I've said, as this are very conjectural, but what the heck, conjecture is all we're ever going to have. Here's another aulos player from the Tomb of the Leopards, as it's called at Tarquinia, and you're hearing a kind of aulos played. A dancer from the Triclinium tomb. Another dancer from the Justiniani tomb. More dancers from the Tomb of the Lioness. And a banquet from the Tomb of the Leopards. One of the media in which Etruscan artists really specialized was baked clay, terracotta, and this example depicts a couple reclining on top of their sarcophagus. The figures are hollow and were apparently made using a technique resembling the lost wax process for bronze. Notice the smiles, which are thought to be another example of Greek influence. These are 6th century works contemporary with the archaic period and the archaic smile in Greek art. This is the so-called Apollo of Veii in the Villa Giulia, which is usually considered the masterpiece of all Etruscan terracotta sculpture, and Jansen says it's superior to anything in any medium in the Greek world of its date, the late 6th century BC. Made to go on top of a temple in Veii, once the Etruscan capital, it's over life size, and making things this large out of terracotta is a real technical as well as an artistic achievement. It is said that the Romans had an Etruscan, maybe the very fellow who made this, called the Rome to make a terracotta statue of Jupiter for the latter's temple on the Capitoline Hill. These horses found at Tarquinia and in the town museum there now were made somewhat later, about 300 BC. Near the end of the period of Etruscan independence from Rome. We probably have here the winged horse Pegasus, which is said to have had a winged horse brother, and it would be hard to find finer horses than these in the whole history of art. The Greek hero Bellerophon rode Pegasus to fight the Chimera. And speaking of the Chimera, here's a bronze one now in the Florentine Museum of Archaeology. This was found in the 16th century at Arezzo and heavily restored in Cellini's workshop. As I mentioned earlier, the Etruscans were famous for their bronze work in general, not just in art, but in the manufacture of weapons and implements of all kinds. The Romans now, who were certainly heavily influenced in a lot of ways by the Etruscans, were nevertheless a different people, though they did, like the Etruscans, think that their ancestors came from Asia Minor. According to Roman tradition, and what became essentially official Roman doctrine after Livy's history and the Aeneid were written, after Troy fell, the hero Aeneas fled the city, and after having numerous adventures arrived with his son Iulus, also called Ascanius, on the coast of Latium south of Rome. Iulus himself then established a settlement at Alba Longa, southeast of where Rome is now. This is where his descendants, Romulus and Remus, were born, and next time we'll hear how they came to be the founders of Rome itself, thanks to the help of a she-wolf.